Hopefully everybody can hear me without the use of the mic. Yeah, please. Yeah, at the back. Cheers. Well, first of all, welcome everyone, and thanks very much for attending tonight. As you're aware, this is the first inaugural Jim McVicar Memorial Lecture. This will be a yearly event for the SSP, and a really important one as well at that in the lifetime and the calendar of the party going forward. So a wee kind of touch just at the start for me on why we're having this event tonight and what the purpose is. Now, of course it is a lecture dedicated to the memory of Jim, but it's not just going to be a eulogy and tribute to Jim, although I'll touch on that myself in a wee second and give my own thoughts on that. The idea of tonight is to try and cover some of the broader topics and struggles that shaped and influenced Jim's outlook, and many of us in this room's outlook and passions, and I'll introduce Richie just in a wee second, and he can explore that in greater detail. So the title for tonight is Socialism Returns in the 21st Century, and just to introduce you to who I am, I'm Mclaughlin. I'm a member of the SSP, joined the party in 2013. I'm from the East End of Glasgow, and I sit on the party's National Executive Committee as well. So as I say, like Jim was, my background is I'm from East End of Glasgow, so right away that was an instant connection between myself and Jim, and at countless meetings and events that we had in the name of the party, Jim would spend ages telling me, and me sitting there listening and soaking in every word about Jim's stories and experiences growing up in East End and then going on to represent what both me and him considered to be the greatest part of the greatest city and the greatest country. So Jim was a man of conviction, principle, unshakable. His beliefs meant a lot to him. Everybody who met him and had the pleasure of being in his company for any length of time can testify to that. He was a powerful orator. He could tear strips, and regularly did, for the Tories, the Labour right, the union bureaucracy, and he also had a special place for criticising those within the independence movement in the SNP whose vision of an independent Scotland was that things would stay just exactly the same and nothing would change. Jim's personally was somebody who was a funny character, very, very friendly, wise, helpful, always on hand to assist, to support, to guide and to advise, particularly for those of us who, and speaking from a main point of view, who had come into the party at a young age, somebody who was prepared to spend as much time as you needed or you wanted with him to explore any subject at all, somebody who was widely read, a real thinker, and at his heart a worker as well. A gentle giant of a man, but with a wicked sense of humour. His presence is missed throughout the SSP on a personal level. Those of us who were lucky enough to get to know him, apologies for getting a bit upset here. Hopefully this event tonight and on a yearly basis does his memory, both in terms of the person that he was and how much of a pivotal and important role that he played within the party justice. And just to touch kind of lastly on with everything that's happening just now with the Tories in Westminster and the crisis that's engulfing them, I found myself thinking today, I wonder how long he's going to last. He must be on the way out. And then I remembered an SSP executive, don't ask me exactly the date or when it happened, but I remember Jim, it was when Theresa May was Prime Minister, and I remember saying to him, Jim, she must be on the way out. She's not going to last much longer. She can't possibly go. And Jim said to me, Liam, don't be daft, son. You're underestimating them big time. This is the most ruthless capitalist organisation the planet's ever seen. They'll bin her when she's no longer of any use. And those words rang true to me today as well, because although we may all be getting excited at the prospects of Johnson getting evicted for number 10 fairly shortly, the Tories are ruthless. They'll only do it when it politically suits them, and they'll very quickly put somebody else in place who's going to carry out the same policies and the same agenda as what Johnson's pursuing just now. And the last thing that I'll say on my relationship personally with Jim was that we did also have another shared passion, a passion for a football team in this city, and without naming its its name, it wasn't the one that resides very close to here, and I'll leave it at that. Now, tonight for me to be chairing this event, and I know for Richie to be speaking at it, is a real honour and a privilege for me personally, particularly because Jim's family and his beloved partner Christine are in the audience tonight as well. So tonight, as I say, Richie's going to be the speaker tonight, delivering the lecture. Now, as I look around the room, I realise that most, but thankfully not all of you, will know Richie already. So Richie's a founding member of the Scottish Socialist Party, the workplace organiser for the party. He's the coordinator of the Scottish Workers' Solidarity Network, and rose to media prominence fairly recently from his sacking at IKEA, the first trade union organiser to be victimised and then subsequently sacked for standing up for the interests of the workers that he represented during COVID. Richie, as I'm sure many of you will testify, is organisationally a force of nature and somebody with an unrelenting drive to advance the cause of socialism and the SSP. He's somebody who's got a level of skill that's rarely matched in his ability to connect working class issues here and now and struggle to broader socialist ideas, thinking and policy. So hopefully you'll all enjoy tonight's lecture. After the lecture, we will be opening it up to questions and comments for anybody who either wants to touch on Jim or anything that Richie says in the context of the lecture that he's going to deliver tonight. So without further ado, I'll introduce Richie Benton.
Well, thanks very much, Liam, and I think after a build-up like that, I'd be wise to leave now while I'm winning, because it might be an anticlimax. But I want to first of all say that it's a tremendous pride I feel in being asked to deliver the first inaugural lecture in the Jim Memorial lecture series that we plan to have over the years to come. It's an honour to speak in honour of a dear friend, a close friend and comrade, as Jim was. And what he represented, Liam has very ably already summarised, but Jim represented, amongst many other things, the best in humanity. He was a humane being, he was a friendly character, he was a very warm sort of individual. He wasn't slow at taking the proverbial out of you through his wicked sense of humour, but he was also very caring, concerned about people, even to the last conversation I had with him, when actually I had to alter the subject because he was quizzing me how I was in the aftermath of being sacked, when I was ringing him in his hospital bed to find out how he was. That was the nature of the man. And only a few weeks earlier, he and Christine, his beloved lifelong partner of over 50 years, had sped away from a medical appointment in order to join the demonstration for my reinstatement to my job. That was an indication of the principles that he stood by throughout his adult life. And the influences in his life, unfortunately, I have to say with regret, I never sat him down and quizzed him what they were. And I suppose that's something all of us are guilty towards each other, because now it's too late to ask. But I would certainly wager it included his parents. I met his father, a relatively quiet, decent working class man, a worker. I never met his mother, who apparently was a feisty union convener, what they call in the trade a mother of the chapel. She was representing the Collins workers in the big book binding and print shop of the time, and apparently was noted for not taking prisoners when she was debating with the right wing of the Labour Party that she was in back in the day. His workplace has also influenced Jim. The first major place he was in was the big British rail engineering workshop in Springburn, St. Rollox area. And that was the place where the shop stewards had a powerful influence, to the extent that he often told me how when he went there first, on the first day he was told, not asked, told he was joining the union, issued with the credentials, and then given a book and told, read that, the next time we meet we'll be discussing it. And it was a copy of the Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels. That was the type of workplace that he entered as a young man. He led an active life as a trade unionist and socialist, including during the period of the miners' strike, where him and Christine and others organised collections in support of the mining community. He was an active leader of the anti-poll tax movement under Thatcher's hated government. He became part of the growing independence movement, but always arguing for a distinctive socialist vision for it. And of course, with the degeneration of the Labour Party into a right-wing pro-capitalist agency, then one of the things that Jim did was not to surrender, not to run for cover like too many people, including alleged lefts, did at the time, but to lend his experience, his reading, his understanding, his political education to the formation of a new socialist challenge in Scotland in the form of the Scottish Socialist Party, which he was a founding member of and dedicated the rest of his time to. Jim actually represents and was part of a rich seam of socialist traditions and class struggle in the Scottish working class. And in playing our part in today's struggles and helping to equip the working class for tomorrow's battles for socialist change, it's necessary and fruitful to glance at least at some of our collective past, the traditions of struggle, solidarity and socialism that we are the modern inheritors of. Now, you could tackle this from God knows how many different directions, but I'll do it this way, at least initially, by taking the building that we're meeting in. We're meeting in the Pearce Institute, or as Govanites call it, the PI. You'll have noticed the architectural grandeur outside, which I'm reliably informed due to my studies of architecture is based on the Dutch Renaissance. Are you impressed? I hope so. But it was bequeathed in quote marks to the working men and women of Govan by Lady Pearce and opened in 1906 in memory of her husband, or late husband, William Pearce. Now, William Pearce, of course, was the owner of Fairfields Shipyard, which is still there by another name just along the road. And in this building, there's still to this day, we're meeting in the billiards room. There's also a theatre. There used to be a laundry. I don't know if there still is. There was a cafe or canteen in the past, even when it was opened. That was social provision for the local population at a time when there was no such thing as social services provided by the state, but was philanthropy on the basis of a ruthless capitalist exploiter. Let's not avoid the issue, because William Pearce epitomised a phase of the history that built the British Empire on the backs of the wage slavery of the working class of millions at home and abroad. Govan grew to become the heart of the Clydeside shipbuilding industry that dominated the world, where at least a quarter of the tonnage was produced on this river at the height of shipbuilding. And there's rich lessons for today's working class when you examine a little bit more about how that came about. Why was Govan chosen to be the site of shipbuilding magnates who, like William Pearce and others, moved from the industrialised centre of London to set up shop in Govan on the Clyde? Why did that take place? There were several reasons, but at the heart of it was the fact that the waters at Govan, aside from any advantages for shipping development, the waters were the gathering point, the entry point for immigrants from the Highlands and from Ireland, from the clearances, amongst other things. And they therefore provided vast pools of cheap labour for the shipbuilding barons. It was also an opportunity to sow division between workers on the grounds of ethnic or national origin, such as the Irish Catholic population, the Highlanders, compared to the Lowlanders that come in to organise and work the yards. And that was used systematically at several stages to lower the wages of the workforce, where, for example, the wages of the Govan shipyard workers were about 10% below those of Liverpool and London at every stage. And the shipbuilding owners transferred the methods of the mill owners directly into the shipyards. For example, by providing certain benefits and even tied housing to a more privileged layer of the workforce, such as managerial grades. And then, on the other hand, an outright ban on trade union organisation within the yards, sacking people who dared to try to unionise the workforce. They carried out wage cuts in periods of the inevitable slumps in the cyclical nature of the shipbuilding industry. Wage cuts of 10%, for example, in one of the years I read about when Pearce himself made £200,000 in profit that year alone. And I'm talking about the 1870s, by the way. So you can imagine what that means in today's money. The end result was that when William Pearce died in 1888, he was worth £1.2 million. And in modern pounds and pence, that's £500 million. He was halfway to being a billionaire when he died. And that's also an interesting statistic without bearing them in them. It's 16,000 times the average wage of the average shipyard worker at the time. 16,000 times. So that's an indication of the wealth divide, and it's an historic reminder of the system that we have to uproot, and the need not to be fooled by philanthropy, whether that came from William Pearce or Elder, who helped to bequeath Elder Park or Elder Park Library just round the corner, and other areas of the Fairfield Club, which I have had a drink in the past. I'll confess I don't know if it's still open, but that philanthropy on the part of the shipbuilding owners is the same rank hypocrisy as the philanthropy of today's capitalist vultures, such as Bill Gates and others 150 years later. So don't be conned by philanthropy when it comes from a capitalist. It's not the same as working class solidarity. It's a different world entirely. Now, another side of that story, equally important, is that organised socialists in Govan played a key role in beginning to combat the divisions that the employers had sown amongst the workforce, in organising and unionising the yard workers and others, including the dockers in Govan at the time, and overcoming the division between the Irish and the Lowlanders, for example, the Highlanders and the Lowlanders, and so on, and winning concessions of the capitalists, including through hard-fought strike action when they suffered grossly as a result of their efforts. For example, the Social Democratic Federation, which despite the name was not Social Democrats in the modern sense, they were Marxists, and eventually their minute secretary in Tradeston, one of the branches in Greater Govan, was John McLean. But the SDF grew in Govan, including amongst the workforce in Fairfields, Harlan and Wolff, and Stevens yards, the 3 yards locally, and they seized periods of shipbuilding upturn, boom, in order to pursue wage claims to try and compensate for the losses and the privations of the workforce. And eventually, through tremendous self-sacrifice, they made this one of the cradles of the labour movement, of the trade union movement, but also of the socialist movement. And of course, if you wanted to skip forward a long time to the 1970s, it was the heart of the UCS workers sit-in in the yards as well, defying the government of Ted Heath at the time. And those socialists consciously overcame the sectarian divisions in the workforce through the common demands and struggles that they helped to lead, uniting the lowest paid labourers from Ireland with the better paid grades of Lowlanders, and even succeeded in turning some of the people who were sent over from Belfast to break strikes into allies, where the workers from Belfast turned back, went home, rather than scab on the workers in Govan. That's the kind of heritage which we should be proud of. Those are some of the episodes of history which should make us all proud to be working class, all proud to be socialist, and to be determined in order to pursue that heritage in the 21st century. And a last word on the PI, the Pearce Institute that we're standing and sitting in here tonight. Much of this building was constructed with the use of free voluntary labour. Now, I wouldn't praise that at one level, because it was an exploiter that could have paid taxes and easily financed it otherwise. But it was an indication of the spirit of collectivism, of the desire to provide socially for the good, the common good of all. That was the spirit of self-sacrifice of working men and women in that period at the turn of the previous century. Now, if we skip forward a century and more to the lifetime of Jim McVicar and of me and some others of a certain vintage in here, what has changed? What has changed? What's the role of the working class today? To put it point blank, does the working class even exist? And what are the prospects for struggle and socialism? Now, Karl Marx, the genius of scientific socialism, made the very telling point that the ideas of the ruling class are in any epoch the ruling ideas. In other words, it's the ideas of the rich, of the capitalist class in this modern time, that dominate the thinking of society as a whole. And one of the particularly dominant ideas, since the 1980s in particular, coming from the ruling class, one of their dominant messages and mottos, which have tried to pummel into the heads of the mass of the population, is that there's no alternative. This is the only system available. Capitalism is the only show in town. And capitalism in the form of neoliberalism is the only alternative on offer. And that's been drummed into the heads of the population. It's found an echo in far too many heads of the trade union movement and far too many treacherous leaders of the Labour Party, and they have sought to impose that philosophy on the rest of us. Capitalism, neoliberalism, is something which was particularly preached and pursued by Maggie Thatcher from the late 70s onwards. And they even coined the acronym TINA, there is no alternative, in order to capture the message they were trying to convey. And they were telling us, in other words, in plain language, accept your lot. Don't try to challenge it. It's futile. Socialism is a myth from the 19th century. It's not for today. And therefore be thankful for small mercies, for a few crumbs of the table of the capitalist class. That was the mission of Thatcher and Reagan. And it was then given pseudo-intellectual stamps of approval by people such as Francis Fukuyama in 1989, when he came out with his declaration of the end of history. Or to briefly quote him more extensively, one sentence or so, what we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. The end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalisation of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. In simple language, nothing's going to change. This is your lot for eternity. Capitalism, red in tooth and claw. Now that claim seemed well founded at the time when there was the collapse of the Stalinist Eastern Bloc that year, and the restoration of capitalism in Eastern Europe, which coincided, luckily for them, with the artificial boom in the capitalist West through a mixture of factors including vast arms expenditure by the powerful military-industrial complex in America and elsewhere, by the crazy credit boom bonanza which was issued to dupe some people into thinking they were quite well off, even though their wages had actually been cut, and the absence of any mass alternative advocating a different form of society at that time in the form of socialism, as the social democratic leaderships across Europe and beyond, spearheaded by that creature Tony Blair, actually swallowed the ruling class ideas of the ruling class like greedy sycophants at the time. that capitalism is the only game in town, there is no alternative. And New Labour did its best to sabotage movements of resistance by workers, most infamously that of the miners in 1984-85, and then when it helped to defeat those struggles, used that as the material basis for adding to the ideological offensive against socialism, aiding and abetting the ruling class in inflicting defeats and then giving it a theoretical gloss by putting forward theories such as a third way and new realism to cover up what is best described as dirty class collaboration against the working class on behalf of the real enemy within the capitalist class. That's what the Labour leadership did in their capitulation to capitalism at the time. And the defeat of the miners, which Jim lived through as an active supporter of the NUM, was a decisive historic turning point, a moment in history for this country in particular, and these islands in particular, for the working class of Scotland and Britain and so on. It disheartened many activists. It disheartened many workers. If the miners can be defeated, none of us can win. It helped the Tories impose the most repressive anti-union legislation in the Western world. Laws that were praised and retained by Blair after the landslide against the Tories, putting him into office in 1997. It was part of a fundamental shift also away from manufacturing industry. Where previously Britain had been the workshop of the world, it turned to financialisation of the economy, making splendid profits for a tiny handful through the most obscene, obscure financial devices on the stock market and elsewhere. And the most parasitic wing of capitalism, finance capitalism, dominated the politics and economy in the time since. And they turned in particular to the services economy, which now makes up the vast majority of employment, for example. And that was accompanied, and was no accidental accompaniment either, it was part of a systematic reduction of the wages share for workers compared to national wealth. That's the period that I've described in written form in the past as the Great Wage Robbery, where, for example, in a period of about 30 years, from the 1980s onwards, £1.3 trillion was robbed of the collective wages of the British working class, which incidentally, by spooky coincidence, was the same sum that was invested in the banks by the state to bail them out in 2008 after the crash. Yes, much has changed regarding the working class in the last century or more, in the period since the PI was opened as a bequeathment to the people of Govan that had created the profits for Pearce in the first place. Then 15,000 workers would pour through the gates of the 3 yards in Govan, part of the 70,000 workers in 19 shipyards on the Clyde at that time, in the shipbuilding centre of the world, in the workshop of the world that was British capitalism. Now there's 3 yards, one of them barely clinging on, with a couple of thousand workers, relying on defence orders to try and keep on to an insecure form of employment. And then, at that time, thousands were employed in the likes of the Springburn Railworks, the Brel, as it was known in more recent times, that Jim worked at as a young man. But in 2019, I think it was closed because the German capitalist owner decided to pull out, and the Scottish government refused to rescue it through the nationalisation that the unions were demanding at the time. It was precisely the organised collectivism of workers in the mines, shipyards, railways, steel plants, engineering, docks, print works and others that challenged capitalists and led to the well-planned strategy of the Tories to smash the unions, or at least deplete them, and to decimate manufacturing in favour of finance capitalism, that most parasitic wing. Manufacturing now only accounts for about 15% of British national production per annum. Britain now, British manufacturing, employs less than 3 million workers for the first time since 1841. That's a catastrophic comment on the state of a productive industry under capitalist rule. But does that mean that the working class has disappeared? Does it pronounce the death knell of socialism, of collective provision for the common good? Was Blair right when he pronounced that we're all middle class now, for example? Absolutely not on all those counts. The prevailing ideas of the ruling class, what the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci called the cultural hegemony of the ruling class, utterly fails to reflect the material and living reality. And a major task of socialists in the 21st century is to expose that myth that they perpetrate, and to do so based on lived experiences. Because the composition of the working class has changed radically, but its existence as a distinct class remains the fundamental truth about the nature of capitalist society. That's the one main definition of capitalism. We still do have manufacturing workers, and it's well worth remembering that. But the two biggest workforces in Britain and Scotland are the health service and retail. And then on top you've got other sectors like hospitality, local government, education, civil service and so on, gathering vast numbers of workers. Another change is the fact that the workforces have been feminised. That is progress compared to the period when there was what was called the marriage ban in workplaces, like so the civil service or the Royal Mail, for example. A ban on women once they got married from continuing in their job, which tragically many of the trade union leaderships were disgracefully slow to oppose until the relatively recent decades. But the feminisation of the workforce is mostly the result of necessity, of families needing two breadwinners, so to speak, to survive. And certainly it does not mean the liberation of working women. Witness the struggle for equal pay 50 odd years after equal pay legislation, a struggle which we in the SSP will play our full part in the coming weeks and months in Glasgow City, for example. Another welcome change in the working class's composition is its multinational, multi-ethnic composition. Again, primarily the result of capitalist globalisation, wars and civil wars fomented by empires, refugee crises and so on, leading to migration. And as with the experiences of migrant workers in the Govan shipyards in the mid-19th century, there's ruthless super-exploitation of migrant workers continuing to this day, alongside vicious incitement to division within the working class on the part of those who seek to divide and weaken the resistance of workers in order to pursue maximisation of profit. That's something that William Pearce and his ilk did 150 years ago approximately, and is something that the employing class and even our governments continue to do today, when the workers otherwise would demand a greater share of GDP in their wage packet and in their social wage in the form of proper enhanced public service provision. And as with the socialist pioneers of 120 years ago, we need to help unite this new, modern, multi-ethnic, multi-gendered working class in struggle. And struggle is the greatest educator against the prevailing false ideas of the ruling class. Another source of great encouragement for 21st century socialists is a process identified by Marx in the middle of the 19th century. And that's, to use the fancy title, the proletarianisation of the middle layers of society. You get that in other countries and continents, particularly, in the form of the urbanisation of society, where peasants are dragged off the land into urban factories and city centres to produce for capitalist enterprises. But we've also witnessed a different version of it in this country, amongst others, where, for example, just give you two examples. In 1926, civil servants, alongside students incidentally, were amongst the main source of supply of scabs against the general strike of the workers' movement of that period. But in contrast, civil servants nowadays are amongst the vanguard of those taking strike action to such an extent that they and their union led by left-wingers and socialists, have been particularly targeted by successive Tory and Labour governments for victimisation in order to teach them a lesson and prevent them becoming the kind of white-collar miners of the modern age. And another example of that process of the proletarianisation of the middle class, which, in case you think I've just invented that phrase for tonight's lecture, I was actually discussing it with some pickets on Thursday and Friday, because it was at picket lines of university lecturers and other university staff, and they were identifying themselves the fact that now they are no longer, as they put it, living in an ivory tower, but actually suffering rampant examples of casualised, insecure labour for sections of the university workforce, and therefore find themselves much closer to ordinary workers, as they expressed it. In other words, there are new forces coming into the organised working class. New forces including the FE College lecturers that have been to the fore in victorious strike action in the last few years, including last year and this year. University lecturers and so on. Sections that in the past, to use a more down-to-earth phrase than the one I've used already, my mother's old expression, my late mother's, she used to say, well, they think they're a step above buttermilk. Now, for those who don't know what buttermilk is, it's not a trendy modern thing you get in trendy delicatessens. Yes, it's that as well. It was part of the diet of the poor in my parents' days, for example, and even in my youth. And therefore, when my mother talked about people thinking they were a step above buttermilk, it meant they were snobs. They thought they were better than the people who had less than them, who relied on buttermilk as a staple of their diet, and potatoes, incidentally, just in case you're wondering. That's not a stereotype, it's a fact. And a central bright byproduct of the decimation of manufacturing industry and the repression of trade unionism has been an unprecedented polarisation of wealth in society, which in itself is living proof that capitalism doesn't work for the majority of the population, that we need a vast wealth transfusion from the rich to the rest of us. In essence, we need socialists to change. Now, on a global level, 8 men, they are all men, 8 men own more combined wealth than 3.5 billion people on this planet. That's a grotesque, simple statistic of a reminder of the world we have to change. And we have every day, every single day, the family that owns Walmart's, and until recently Asda, increased their wealth by $100 million every single day. Jeff Bezos by $250 million every single day of the year. That's a reminder of the world we have to change, of the fact that capitalism doesn't work for the vast majority of the population. And in addressing the question of whether the working class exists, its role and prospects for struggle, it's vitally important to view this as internationalists and not to become whatever the Scottish equivalent of Anglo-centric is. I don't actually know. Like Hustle-centric or something? Make it up, you know what I mean. We shouldn't be narrow-minded and nationalist in our outlook. We have to see it globally. Because here is another change in the composition of the working class compared to a century or more ago. It's no longer a working class primarily based in what used to be called the advanced capitalist countries of the West. We now, for example, in China, have for the first time a predominantly urban population, including 100 million industrial workers alone in China. We have globally 3 billion people who are wage workers, the prime definition of the working class. And for every 1 worker in the West, there's now 5 in China, Russia, Eastern Europe, Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Think global, and you get a sense of the power of the working class potentially on a global level. Because here's the fundamental fact. For the first time in the history of humanity, an absolute majority of the population are workers, are wage slaves of the capitalist system. And that in itself should be an indication of the potential for collective struggle by that very class once it becomes conscious of itself as a class, and not just itself, a class in society. Nor are they passive victims of capitalist exploitation. I don't have time to elaborate greatly on this point, but let me put it this way in summary: that while strikes and struggles of other forms have been at a relatively and historically low level for a few recent years in Scotland or Britain, although that's beginning to change in the last couple of years, whilst that's the case, it's not the picture globally. Because, for example, 79 countries since 2008 have had some form of mass movements or uprisings which have won concessions or in some cases toppled governments all over every continent. And there's a difference. The 1848 revolutions were all in Europe. The 1917 to 1919 revolutions and the impact of the Russian Revolution was primarily and overwhelmingly in Europe, although it touched other continents to an extent. But now it's a global movement of workers who are prepared to go out and face bullets and tear gas and police dogs and army personnel and such like torture and execution in order to stand up for their rights for improvement in their lot. And that surely should be a source of encouragement for working class socialists in the 21st century. Now, there are some exceptional periods in history where millions go through a mass experience simultaneously that leaves a massive imprint on the collective consciousness of people. One such period in this country, to pick a not totally random example, was the Second World War. It triggered revolts and revolutions in various countries, and above all in this country, it was expressed as the demand for what became the National Health Service and the welfare state. Now let me be clear. In my opinion, that was nowhere near socialism. The Labour government of 1945-51 was nowhere like a socialist government. After all, they encamped troops on the docks to put down docker strikes, amongst other things. They sent in troops against the colonial masses who tried to fight for independence from the British Empire. So no, it wasn't a socialist government. But the conquering of a national health service, allegedly at least free at the point of use, was a jewel in the crown of that struggle, and it was something that is, at its very core, is socialistic. It's universal provision at the time of need, free of charge, as I said, allegedly at least. It's no longer quite as clear-cut. And it was the result of mass movements and threatened revolts which forced the capitalists to concede reform from above to prevent revolution from below. That was an experience born of going through the war, seeing the state organise the war effort against the Nazis, seeing the way in which society was coordinated and organised in the war effort, seeing self-sacrifice, and then demanding change for the masses who had suffered as a result of that war effort. And I would say that potentially at least, the COVID crisis could have some of the same impact and concentrated impact on the consciousness of people, provided organised workers' movements and socialists help to articulate and organise for the change that it highlights to be necessary. Because COVID highlighted several things. The fact that capitalism kills people and desecrates the planet. That capitalist markets, the ruling idea of the ruling class, utterly fails to protect human life, let alone improve it. We see that, for example, with the vaccine nationalism on the globe. We see it with, for example, the fact that this new mutant of COVID-19, Omicron, which incidentally is an anagram of moronic, which applies to one of the governments we're saddled with in Scotland. But that new strain developed and was first identified in countries like Botswana. Botswana is a country where 80% of the population have not been vaccinated. Why? Because capitalist rules of the game dictate that you cannot waiver patent rights in order to universalise the provision of vaccines. Unlike, for example, the man who devised the polio vaccine and refused to patent it, saying it belonged to humanity. That capitalist greed dictates death for millions of people on the globe, and that's been illustrated during the COVID crisis and still is. It exposed also the callous cruelty of the ruling class and its Tories, whether it be their theory of herd immunity in the first weeks of the outbreak of COVID in this country. Let them die by letting it spread and not immunise the herd. That was the philosophy they adopted, which incidentally was tail-ended by the Scottish Government and people like Jason Leach, who I've got my own reaction to. It gets far too good press in my opinion. But that is one end of it. Or you get the Downing Street party, where they gloat, as is now revealed on video, they gloat and joke at a time when hundreds had died the very day when they were having that party at Westminster. That callous, cruel indifference to human beings, that's a particular hallmark of the imperial arrogance of the British ruling class, has begun to reveal itself with its fangs to a bigger section of the population than was the case 2 years ago before COVID arrived on these shores. And it also revealed to many that there's such a thing as a working class. It was the health workers, the care staff, the supermarket staff, the food producers, the farm labourers, the drivers, the cleansing workers, the utility workers, the Royal Mail staff, transport drivers and so on, a whole phalanx of people who kept society taken over and semi-civilised at a time when it wouldn't make a whit of difference if the billionaires permanently went into space on a space holiday. That's the difference. And the solidarity and self-sacrifice displayed during COVID is also something that has at least some residual impact on the consciousness of people. But now what they've been rewarded with for those efforts is fire and rehire, pay cuts, vicious attacks, and mind-boggling and mind-blowing overwork and overstretching as a result of staff cuts. But so the experience of COVID-19 heightened class consciousness for at least some people, even though allegedly affected us all. Now, socialism only becomes the common sense of the masses of people when events create the conditions for such conclusions. And I believe, and this is drawn towards a conclusion, I believe that the climate crisis is potentially a new opening for the mass growth of socialism within the population, in a fashion not seen for a number of generations. Past generations, younger people in particular, but not exclusively, were radicalised in a left-wing direction by previous waves of struggle, such as the general strikes, the barricades, and the mass protests for civil rights that erupted in various countries in 1968, or the naked class warfare of the ruling class and Tories and their state against the miners in 1984-5, or the movements against the invasion of Iraq in 2003, when 30 million people demonstrated in 600 cities across the world. Of course, in a sense, that movement was defeated because they went ahead with the invasion. But that radicalised people to an extent. And the crash of 2008 in the financial banking system also caused people to begin to question the efficacy and the saintly nature of capitalism as a system, whether or not it was the only game in town. But the climate crisis, being an existential crisis for humanity, that only fundamental transformational change in the political economy can begin to secure our future against, is something that I think could open up the case for socialism on a mass scale. In the mass industrialised slaughter of World War I, that great revolutionary socialist Rosa Luxemburg warned that the choices were socialism or barbarism. Now, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say we face choices between socialism and extinction in a slightly medium-term sense. But as with all other issues, socialism has to be turned into the language of jobs, secure incomes, vastly improved universal basic services, and the rights of the people, if it's to become the property of the masses, if it's to become the idea of millions, and therefore become, as Marx put it, a material force for change, by being an idea attached to the minds of millions and not just a handful of thinkers. And the idea, which we first elaborated in the early months of COVID-19, of a socialist Green New Deal, captures that notion and needs to be fought for in every workplace, every college, every street we can do campaigning in, every community organisation, every climate group that we can gain access to. It's rooted in the idea of public ownership of the likes of energy in all its different forms, including renewable, public transport in all its forms, the construction industry, the banking industry to finance it instead of financing fossil capitalism as they do, the major industries and all that, in order to plan for need and for use value rather than to produce for profit. And as we've meticulously researched and elaborated in our new book, which I'm sure you'll all buy, Socialist Change, Not Climate Change, the new socialist bestseller, it's entirely realistic that in Scotland alone, that socialist Green New Deal could bring forward a number of concrete material gains for the working class population. It could build 100,000 new eco-homes to such a standard as to cut down emissions and cut down fuel bills. It could provide affordable green energy by taking it out of the hands of the profiteers who leave us in a state of crisis, where, for example, my family's fixed tariff has risen this month from £64 a month to £104 a month. 61% increase, and that was the best deal available. It could involve the building and expansion and integration of free public transport to bring people out of their cars and cut pollution as well as poverty. It could retrofit every house and public building to cut down emissions and improve their lives. It could invest in localised, sustainable agriculture, thereby also cutting down food miles and so on. And in doing all of that and other things, could create at least 350,000 skilled, well-paid, unionised jobs in Scotland alone. Ours is a vision of hope and plenty for all. But it won't be conquered unless the organised workers' movement spearheads worker-led plans of green alternative production to bring about and fight for worker-led transition to clean, green production for social need, not for private greed. And the Scottish Government falls flat on its face when it comes to pursuing such urgent tasks. Because under public protest and the protest pressure, they eventually sided over to deciding they were against opening up the Cambo oil field. But they failed miserably to produce any idea of alternative green jobs for the workers potentially affected. And as socialists, let's be quite plain speaking, the science dictates there should be no more licensing of oil and gas exploration. But we cannot subject the workers in that industry to what I've called a no-deal exit from oil and gas. We have to instead construct a public energy service that builds the wind turbines, the marine technology, the solar energy equipment and all the rest of it in the likes of the Bifab yards, the shipyards and new engineering factories providing jobs as well as the equipment for green energy. We need to take the entire transport system into democratic public ownership, to reopen the likes of the Springburn railworks that Jim used to work in, and others like it, and new ones like it, to build and maintain the railway rolling stock for such a free transport network, or to build the buses that are needed, electric or green hydrogen buses for free public transport, and to create the jobs for local production of the means to establish a vastly expanded free public transport network. That's the route to combating pollution and poverty simultaneously, instead of exporting jobs and exporting pollution, which is what the Scottish Government actually does. Because William Pearce, Stevens, Elder and the other shipping industry or shipbuilding industry magnates, they all hunted around to find the best source of cheap labour, which could be divided and conquered in the process for maximisation of profit. And they discovered Govan as one of their sources of that combination. Today, when it comes to building wind turbines or decommissioning the oil and gas rigs from the North Sea, 21st century capitalists and a Scottish government, which now has been propped up by the Scottish Green Party, which refuses to challenge their rule and their ruling ideas, hunts the entire globe for cheap, exploitable labour. They use cheap labour in Indonesia, for example, to build the blades, the jackets for the wind turbines, and then drag them 7,000 miles across the oceans, belching out pollution to bring them back to the Fife coast where they could have been built in the first place. They exploit cheap labour, including child labour, on the beaches of Bangladesh and India, using handheld gas axes to cut down the oil rigs that have been dragged from the North Sea to there, to decommission them, and then make boastful claims of Scotland being a net zero nation by 2045. They export pollution, they export jobs, and they export any meaningful sense of the idea of a just transition. Socialist collective ownership, workers' control and management, and socialist planning is the solution that screams out for our attention as the planet burns, as species disappear, and as the deadly coronaviruses erupt one after the other. And it's also the basis, importantly, for a reindustrialisation of Scotland and other countries, for the formation, you could say, of a new green industrial proletariat, which would have the power that has been taken away from industrial workers of the past in the likes of the shipyards, mining and elsewhere, but this time on an environmentally safe basis. But this perfectly rational idea, like all rational ideas, will only become a reality when millions absorb and adopt it as their idea, and when the social class power of the working class is mobilised to overcome the vested class interests of the capitalists and landlords of the world. We can be confident of big movements and mass uprisings in the 21st century, as occurred in recent years in the Arab Spring, in the revolt of the Greek people, in numerous strikes, general strikes and occupations of public spaces in Latin America, including the overthrow of governments and many other places. But what cannot be guaranteed in advance is the outcome of such revolts. That requires the patient but urgent construction of mass socialist parties, firmly rooted in the working class and amongst young people. Just one quick example. The Greek people occupied squares in revolt against the austerity being imposed by the European Central Bank, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. 1 in 3 of the Greek population took part in those protests, and they elected a left-sounding government in the form of Syriza in the hope that they would transform their lives and protect them from mass austerity, only to be shattered in their hopes by the Syriza leadership surrendering without a whimper, let alone a serious battle against the forces of European and world finance capital. That's why we need socialist parties, including a Scottish Socialist Party, that's steeled in its determination to defy and defeat the capitalist ruling class, based on our scientific belief that the working class not only exists, but is the one primary engine for socialist change and progress in society. That's the type of party that Jim McVicar devoted his adult life to building. He was a man who was proud to be working class, proud to be socialist, and never faltered in his attempts to construct such a party alongside the rest of us. Nothing is predetermined in history. Its evolution is the result of clashes between rival, living class forces. And in the words of James Connolly, the only true prophets are those who carve out the future that they announce. Let the rich history of the working class and the heroic efforts and track record of many socialists over many decades be sources of pride, sources of encouragement, and sources of rich lessons for those of us that want to learn those and apply them today. Learn from the past to fight for the present and create a socialist future in the 21st century. This is not the end of history. Potentially, if we go about it right, it's the openings of a new chapter in human history, a socialist future based on human solidarity. Thank you.